Hey, my name is Robert Callahan. I'm 71 years old, and 4 months ago, I stood in the parking lot of the Sullivan County Animal Shelter, holding a leash attached to a nervous, trembling old beagle mix named Biscuit, while a woman I had never met stood 10 feet away, crying harder than I was, and neither of us could figure out who that dog belonged to more. I need to tell you how that happened, because it started with a promise I made to my dying wife in a hospital room, and it ended with something I never expected to find at 71 years old, which was a second reason to get up in the morning. My wife Eleanor and I were married for 44 years. We met at a church potluck in Kingsport, Tennessee when I was 24 and she was 22, and I still remember the exact moment I fell for her, which was when she told the pastor's wife quite firmly that her potato salad needed more mustard. Eleanor was never afraid to tell the truth, even when the truth was inconvenient, and I loved that about her for every single day of our marriage. She had a way of looking at a room and knowing exactly what needed fixing, whether it was a bad recipe, a misbehaving student, or a husband who was about to make a foolish decision. I learned early on that arguing with Eleanor once she had made up her mind was a waste of good breath, and most of the time, when I finally gave in and did things her way, she turned out to be right. We raised 3 children in a modest brick house on Maple Crest Lane. I worked 31 years as a machinist at the same plant. Eleanor taught second grade for 28 years and knew, I am fairly certain, the name of every child who ever passed through Kingsport Elementary School during that time. We had a good life, not an extraordinary one, not the kind of life people write books about, but a good, steady, honest life built on Sunday dinners and porch conversations and the particular comfort of loving the same person for so long that you stop being able to remember what it felt like not to. Eleanor got sick 18 months ago. Ovarian cancer, stage 3 by the time they found it, which the doctors explained gently but firmly meant we were not talking about years, we were talking about months, and even that was generous. Eleanor took the news the way she took most things in her life, with a kind of clear-eyed practicality that left no room for self-pity. She made lists. She organized her affairs, going through the filing cabinet with a determination that left nothing for me to figure out later. She wrote letters to each of our 3 children and sealed them for later. And on a Tuesday afternoon in her hospital room, about 6 weeks before she died, she reached over and took my hand and said something that would change the entire shape of my life after she was gone. "Robert," she said, "I need you to promise me something, and I need you to actually do it, not just say yes to make me feel better." I told her anything. She looked at me hard, the way she used to look at misbehaving second graders, a look that meant business. "I need you to get a dog after I'm gone." I laughed, assuming she was joking, the way sick people sometimes joke to lighten a heavy room. She didn't laugh back. "I'm serious, Robert. You are going to come home to an empty house, and you are the kind of man who will sit in a recliner and stare at a television for the rest of your natural life if something doesn't force you to get up and take care of it. I've watched you for 44 years. I know exactly what you'll do if nobody stops you." I tried to argue. I told her I didn't know the first thing about dogs, that we had never had one, that at 70 years old, the idea of training a puppy sounded exhausting rather than comforting. Eleanor squeezed my hand. "Not a puppy," she said. "An old dog, a rescue from the shelter, one nobody else wants because he's got gray on his muzzle and problems in his hips. Same as you're going to have. You two can be old and cranky together." That made me laugh for real, and she smiled, satisfied, the way she always looked when she had won an argument, which was most of them. "Promise me, Robert." I promised her. I did not fully understand, at the time, what I was promising myself into. Eleanor died on a rainy Thursday morning in March, with our children gathered around her bed, and me holding the same hand I had held in that conversation about the dog. The funeral was small, the way she wanted it, held at the same church where we had met 46 years earlier, over a bowl of improperly seasoned potato salad. Afterward, our children stayed for 2 weeks, taking turns cooking meals I mostly didn't eat, and asking me questions about my plans that I didn't have answers for. Eventually, they had to return to their own lives in Nashville, and Charlotte, and Richmond, and I was left alone in the house on Maple Crest Lane with 44 years of shared silence, suddenly turned into just my own. Eleanor had been right, of course. She was almost always right. Within a month, I had settled into exactly the pattern she predicted. I woke late. I ate cereal standing over the sink because sitting at our kitchen table alone felt unbearable. the chair across from mine holding 44 years of breakfast conversations that had simply stopped. I sat in my recliner and watched television programs I couldn't have named an hour after they ended. I stopped answering half my phone calls, letting them ring through to voicemail because summoning the energy for small talk felt like more than I had to give. I stopped going to the hardware store on Saturdays, a ritual Eleanor and I had shared for decades even though she never bought anything. Just liked walking the aisles with me and commenting on how overpriced everything had become. The days blurred into each other with a specific gray sameness that I recognize now as the particular texture of grief when it isn't given anything to push against. About 6 weeks after the funeral, I found the promise sitting heavy in my chest one morning while I was standing at the sink eating cereal I couldn't taste. I thought about Eleanor's face when she made me promise, the seriousness underneath the joke about being old and cranky together. I thought about how she had spent her entire life taking care of other people, students, children, me, and how even from a hospital bed she had been thinking about how to take care of me after she was gone. I finished my cereal, put on real clothes for the first time in a week, and drove to the Sullivan County Animal Shelter. The shelter was a low brick building on the edge of town, the kind of place that always smells faintly of disinfectant and dog food, no matter how clean it actually is. A young woman at the front desk, maybe 25, with kind eyes and a name tag that said Amy, asked if she could help me. I explained, somewhat awkwardly, that my wife had recently died and had made me promise to adopt an older rescue dog, and that I didn't really know what I was doing, but I was trying to keep my promise. Amy's face softened in the particular way of someone who has heard 100 sad stories and hasn't yet become numb to them. She led me back through a hallway of barking, bouncing younger dogs, past cages of energetic mutts jumping against the wire, until we reached a quieter section in the back where the older dogs stayed. Most of them barely lifted their heads when we walked past. Shelter dogs learn quickly, I would come to understand, that visitors rarely come for them. But one dog, in a cage near the end of the row, sat up slowly when I approached. He was a beagle mix, maybe 50 pounds, with a graying muzzle, one ear that stood up and one that flopped over, and dark brown eyes that looked at me with an expression I can only describe as cautious hope. The look of a creature who has been disappointed before but hasn't entirely given up on being chosen. A small placard on his cage read, "Biscuit, approximately 9 years old, surrendered." Amy noticed me looking at him. "That's Biscuit," she said. "He's been with us almost 4 months now. Older dogs are always the hardest to place. Most people come in wanting puppies." I crouched down in front of the cage. Biscuit shuffled closer, pressing his gray muzzle against the wire, and I felt something in my chest loosen slightly for the first time since Eleanor's funeral. "What's his story?" I asked. Amy's expression flickered, something careful passing over her face. "It's a little complicated," she said. "He actually came to us as a stray, emaciated, in rough shape. We weren't sure he was going to make it at first. He spent about 2 months in foster care getting healthy before we brought him back to the shelter for adoption." "Why bring him back if he was in a good foster home?" Amy hesitated in a way that made me curious. "The foster situation changed," she said carefully. "But I think it's probably a conversation better had with the foster herself if you're serious about adopting him. She still checks in on him sometimes. I could give you her number if that's all right." I told her that would be fine, though at the time I didn't think much of it. I was focused entirely on the dog in front of me, this scruffy old beagle mix with mismatched ears, who had already, in the space of about 4 minutes, worked his way further into my broken heart than I had expected any living creature to manage. I adopted Biscuit that same afternoon. The paperwork took longer than I expected. Health records and vaccination histories, and a small mountain of forms. But by 4 o'clock I was standing in the shelter parking lot, with a leash in one hand, and an old dog looking up at me, with an expression that seemed to say he understood something important had just happened, even if he wasn't entirely sure what. He walked stiffly beside me toward my car, pausing every few steps to sniff at something in the grass. And I found myself already talking to him, the way I imagined foolish people talk to dogs, telling him about the house he was about to see, the yard he could run in, the promise that had brought us together. That was when the woman appeared. She came around the corner of the building at a near run, dark hair coming loose from a ponytail, cardigan half-buttoned like she had left the house in a hurry. She stopped short when she saw us, her hand flying to her mouth. "Biscuit," she said, and her voice cracked on the name. The dog's entire body transformed. His tail, which had been hanging low and uncertain since we left the shelter, began wagging so hard his whole back end shook. He lunged toward her, straining against the leash, and I let him go because it seemed cruel not to. The woman dropped to her knees on the pavement, not caring about her clothes, and wrapped her arms around the old beagle's neck, and Biscuit licked her face over and over while making a sound somewhere between a whine and a whimper that I had never heard from him in our brief acquaintance. I stood there holding the empty leash, watching a reunion I clearly wasn't part of, feeling like an intruder in a moment that belonged to someone else. When she finally looked up at me, her eyes were red and wet, and she looked almost as embarrassed as she was emotional. "I'm so sorry," she said, wiping her face with the back of her hand. "I'm Diane Foster. I fostered him, back when he first came in. Amy called me to say someone was adopting him today, and I needed to see him one more time before he went home with someone new." I introduced myself, feeling awkward in a way I hadn't anticipated. Diane looked to be somewhere in her late 60s, with kind gray eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, silver-streaked dark hair, and the weathered, capable hands of someone who has spent a lot of time working outdoors or with animals. She kept one hand on Biscuit's head the entire time we talked, as if she couldn't quite make herself stop touching him. "I should explain," she said, still catching her breath. "I found Biscuit as a stray about 6 months ago, wandering along Route 11 near my property, starving, barely able to walk. I brought him home, nursed him back to health over about 10 weeks. We got close, real close." Her voice wavered. "But my husband passed away 4 months ago, very suddenly, a heart attack, and I had to move in temporarily with my daughter while I figured out what to do with our house, and her apartment complex doesn't allow dogs over 30 pounds. I had to bring him back to the shelter. It was one of the worst days of my life, if I'm being honest, second only to losing Robert." I felt my chest tighten at the mention of the name. "Robert?" I asked. Diane looked up at me, surprised. "My husband, Robert Foster." "Why?" I let out a breath that was half laugh, half something closer to disbelief. "That's my name too," I said. "Robert Callahan. My wife Eleanor died 4 months ago as well. Made me promise, right before she passed, to adopt an old rescue dog because she knew I'd fall apart alone in an empty house otherwise." Diane's hand went still on Biscuit's head. We looked at each other for a long moment in that shelter parking lot. Two strangers who had each lost a spouse within weeks of each other, both connected now to the same scruffy old beagle mix, both named after the same word in different ways. "Well," Diane said finally, a small unsteady laugh escaping her, "I suppose that's either the strangest coincidence I've ever heard, or Biscuit here has better taste in people than either of us realized." I didn't know what to do with the moment, so I did the only thing that felt natural. I asked if she wanted to sit with him a while longer before we left, and she said yes, gratefully, and we ended up sitting on a bench outside the shelter for the better part of an hour, Biscuit lying contentedly between us, with his head resting on Diane's lap, and one paw stretched toward my leg, as if he had appointed himself the physical bridge between two grieving strangers. Diane told me about her husband Robert, 41 years of marriage, a heart attack while he was out mowing their lawn, no warning at all. She told me about the strange guilt she felt over fostering Biscuit and then having to give him up, how it felt like losing something all over again right on top of losing her husband. I told her about Eleanor, about the promise, about the strange grace of walking into a shelter with grief in my chest and walking out with a leash in my hand. We talked until the shelter was closing and Amy came out to gently let us know they needed to lock up. Before we parted ways, Diane hesitated, then asked if she could get my number so she could check in on Biscuit occasionally, see how he was settling in. I gave it to her without hesitation. Something about the whole encounter had felt less like a chance meeting and more like an appointment I hadn't known I had. Biscuit and I settled into our life together slowly, the way you'd expect two old creatures adjusting to new circumstances to do. He was anxious for the first week, pacing the house at night, refusing to eat unless I sat with him, whining softly at the front door as if waiting for someone else to come home too. I understood that feeling more than I wanted to admit. We were both grieving in our own way. Two beings who had lost the center of their world and were trying to figure out how to build a smaller one around a stranger. But slowly, things began to shift. Biscuit started sleeping through the night in a dog bed I placed beside my bed, close enough that I could hear his breathing, which for the first time in weeks made the silence of the house feel less absolute. He began following me from room to room with the devoted persistence particular to beagles, resting his chin on my knee while I ate breakfast at the kitchen table, a habit that somehow made it easier to sit there again, to occupy that space that had felt so unbearably empty in the weeks after Eleanor died. I started taking him for walks around the neighborhood every morning, which got me out of the recliner and into actual daylight for the first time in longer than I wanted to admit. And neighbors I hadn't spoken to in months started stopping to say hello, to ask about the new dog, to comment on how good it was to see me out and about. Eleanor had been right, as she almost always was. The dog was forcing me to keep living in a way that nothing else had managed to. Diane called about 2 weeks after we met, her voice careful and a little uncertain, asking how Biscuit was settling in. I told her honestly about the anxious pacing that first week, about the way he was slowly coming around, about how he still occasionally sat by the front door in the evenings like he was waiting for someone. Diane was quiet for a moment. "He used to do that with me too," she said softly. "I think losing your person, even a temporary one, does something to a dog's heart that takes a long time to heal." I asked if she wanted to come see him. There was a pause before she answered, and I understood she was weighing something. The awkwardness of a widow visiting a dog she had loved and lost, now living with a widower she barely knew. But she said yes, and that Saturday she came by the house on Maplecrest Lane for the first time. Biscuit's reaction when he saw her was immediate and overwhelming. The same frantic, joyful greeting from the shelter parking lot, and watching them together on my living room floor, I felt something complicated stir in my chest. A mixture of gladness for the dog's happiness and a strange, unexpected ache I didn't have a name for yet. We had coffee that afternoon, sitting at my kitchen table while Biscuit lay contentedly between our chairs, his head shifting between our feet, as if trying to claim us both equally. Diane told me more about her 41 years with her Robert, a gentle, quiet man who had worked as a high school history teacher and spent his weekends restoring old furniture in their garage. I told her more about Eleanor, about her fierce opinions on potato salad and second graders, and the exact right way to fold a fitted sheet, a skill I still hadn't mastered. We laughed more than either of us expected to, given the circumstances, and when Diane left that evening she asked somewhat shyly if it would be all right to visit again sometime. I told her Biscuit would like that. I did not examine too closely why I found myself hoping she would come back regardless of what the dog wanted. Over the following months, Diane's visits became a regular occurrence. What started as occasional Saturday afternoons slowly became a weekly ritual, then something closer to twice a week, always centered around Biscuit, but increasingly, unmistakably, about something more than that. She would bring homemade banana bread, a recipe she said her husband had loved, and I found myself looking forward to Wednesday and Saturday mornings with an anticipation I hadn't felt about anything since long before Eleanor got sick. We took Biscuit on walks together around Kingsport, along the same trails Eleanor and I used to walk decades earlier when our children were small, and Diane told me stories about her late husband with the same easy affection I found myself using when talking about Eleanor. Both of us, it seemed, instinctively understanding that grief shared with someone who has walked a similar road doesn't feel like betrayal, it feels like company. There was a particular afternoon in early June, about 4 months after we met, when everything shifted into a clarity I hadn't allowed myself to see before. We were sitting on my back porch, Biscuit sprawled in a patch of sunlight between us, and Diane was quiet for longer than usual, turning her coffee cup slowly in her hands. "Robert," she said finally, not looking at me, "can I ask you something honest?" I told her, of course. "Do you think it's strange," she said slowly, "that I look forward to seeing you almost as much as I look forward to seeing him?" My chest tightened in a way I recognized but hadn't let myself name. "I don't think it's strange," I said carefully. "I think I've been feeling something similar and been too much of a coward to say it out loud." Diane looked up at me then, her gray eyes uncertain and hopeful all at once. "I keep telling myself it's too soon," she said, "that it would be disloyal to Robert's memory, disrespectful somehow, to feel something like this only 4 months after burying him." I understood that fear completely, because I had been carrying an identical version of it myself. "Eleanor made me promise to get a dog," I said slowly, because she knew I'd fall apart alone otherwise. "She never said anything about a person, but I keep thinking, if she was thoughtful enough to plan for the dog, maybe she would have wanted this too. Maybe she'd be furious with me for sitting here too scared to say something true because I'm worried about being disloyal to a woman who spent her whole life taking care of everyone around her, including, apparently, planning for my grief before she was even gone." Diane's eyes filled with tears. "Robert would have liked you," she said. "He always said the measure of a good man was whether he took care of things nobody else wanted to. An old dog, a grieving widow. He would have approved of both, I think." I reached across the small space between our chairs and took her hand, weathered and capable, the hand of a woman who had nursed a starving stray dog back to health out of pure kindness with no expectation of anything in return. I don't want to replace either of them, I said. Eleanor or your Robert. I don't think that's possible, and I don't think it's what this is. No, Diane agreed softly. I don't think it is either. I think this is something that only exists because of them, not instead of them. We sat there for a long time after that, holding hands on my back porch while Biscuit slept between us in a patch of afternoon sun. Two people who had each lost a spouse within weeks of each other, brought together by a starving stray dog with mismatched ears, slowly discovering that grief, given enough time and the right companion, doesn't always stay grief. Sometimes it turns into something else entirely. The following months brought their own complications, the way any real relationship does. Diane's daughter, Marie, was cautiously supportive, but understandably protective, having watched her mother struggle through the sudden loss of her father. And it took several long conversations over dinner before Marie felt reassured that I wasn't some opportunist taking advantage of her mother's grief. My own children were, for the most part, quietly relieved. My daughter Sarah called me one evening in July, her voice cautious. "Dad," she said, "are you seeing someone?" I told her the truth, that I wasn't entirely sure what to call it, but that Diane had become important to me in a way I hadn't expected and wasn't sure how to explain. Sarah was quiet for a moment. "Mom would want this," she said finally. "You know that, right? She literally engineered a scenario where you'd have to leave the house and take care of something. I don't think it's a stretch to imagine she'd approve of you finding someone to take care of, too." I hadn't thought of it in quite those terms before, but once Sarah said it, I couldn't stop turning the idea over in my mind. Eleanor had always been 3 steps ahead of everyone, in life, and apparently, it seemed, in her planning for what would come after it. There was a particular Sunday in September, about 7 months after we had met in that shelter parking lot, when Diane and I took Biscuit on a long walk along the same trail where Eleanor and I used to walk. The leaves just beginning to turn at the edges with the first hints of fall color. Biscuit, older now and slower than when I first adopted him, moved at his own unhurried pace, stopping frequently to investigate interesting smells while Diane and I walked slowly beside him, in no rush to reach any particular destination. "I've been thinking," Diane said, as we walked, "about selling my house. Marie's apartment situation isn't sustainable long term, and I've been staying with her far longer than either of us intended." I felt something tighten in my chest, an old fear surfacing unexpectedly. "Where would you go?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Diane glanced at me sideways, a small, knowing smile playing at the corner of her mouth. "I don't know yet," she said. "I suppose that depends on some conversations I haven't quite worked up the courage to have." I understood, suddenly and completely, what she was gesturing toward without saying directly. We stopped walking. Biscuit, sensing the shift, sat down between us with the patient stillness particular to old dogs who understand, in whatever way dogs understand things, that something important is happening. "Diane," I said, "I don't know exactly what this is, or what to call it, or whether 71 years old is too old to be standing on a walking trail feeling like a nervous teenager. But I know that the days you come to my house have become the best days of my week, and I know that Biscuit isn't the only reason I look forward to seeing you." Diane's eyes filled with tears, the same particular brightness I had seen the very first day in the shelter parking lot. "Robert," she said, "I think I fell in love with you somewhere around the 3rd time you told me a story about Eleanor's opinions on properly folded sheets, and I have been entirely too scared to say so." I laughed, and something in my chest that had been clenched tight since Eleanor's funeral finally fully released. Around us, the trail was quiet except for the sound of the creek somewhere off to the left, and a woodpecker working steadily at a tree overhead. And I remember thinking that Eleanor would have found something to say about the absurdity of 2 grown adults standing on a hiking trail, crying over a beagle, and that whatever she would have said would have been exactly right. "Move in with me," I said, the words coming out before I had fully planned them, surprising myself as much as her. "Not right away, not if it feels too fast, but eventually. There's room in the house, there's room in Biscuit's heart, and I think, somewhat improbably, there might be room in mine too." Diane laughed through her tears, dropping to her knees to bury her face briefly in Biscuit's fur. The same gesture from the day we met, except this time it looked less like grief and more like joy. "I think Biscuit already decided that months ago," she said. "I think we're the last 2 people to catch up to what he already knew." Diane moved into the house on Maple Crest Lane the following spring, almost exactly 1 year after we met in that shelter parking lot. We didn't rush toward marriage, both of us understanding, at our age and with our particular histories, that some things are better built slowly and deliberately. But we built a life together, one that honored rather than erased what had come before. Diane brought photographs of her Robert, which we hung in the hallway alongside photographs of Eleanor, and our respective children eventually became close enough that Marie and Sarah started a group text chain that, according to both of them, was mostly dedicated to teasing their parents about how long it had taken us both to admit our feelings. Biscuit, older now, slower, gray-muzzled and content, spent his days moving contentedly between the two of us, sleeping half the night curled against my side of the bed and half against Diane's, as if determined to remain equally devoted to both people who had, in their own ways, saved each other through him. We were married 18 months after that first meeting in the shelter parking lot, a small ceremony in the backyard of the house on Maple Crest Lane, our children standing beside us, Biscuit wearing a small bow tie that he tolerated with visible reluctance for approximately 4 minutes before shaking it off entirely, which felt somehow entirely appropriate. Sarah walked me partway down the small aisle of folding chairs, insisting that after everything, someone needed to make sure I actually showed up, and Marie stood beside her mother in a soft blue dress, crying before the ceremony had even properly begun. The late afternoon sun slanted gold across the yard, and somewhere in the middle of it all, Biscuit managed to escape his bow tie entirely and trot proudly around the guests as though he, more than anyone, deserved the credit for the day. In my vows, I said something I had been turning over in my mind for months. Eleanor made me promise to get an old dog, I said, looking at Diane, because she knew exactly what I needed to keep living after she was gone. I don't think she could have known she was also somehow arranging for me to meet you. But I've come to believe that the people who love us best never really stop taking care of us, even after they're gone. And I think Eleanor would be exactly as pleased about this as I am, standing here today. Diane cried through her own vows, telling the small gathered crowd about a stray dog on Route 11, about a husband who taught history and restored old furniture, about grief that had somehow, against every reasonable expectation, transformed into something that felt entirely like joy. Biscuit gave us both a reason to keep getting up in the morning, she said, but Robert gave me a reason to actually want to. I am 72 years old now, and I have been loved fully and completely by two remarkable people in one lifetime. First for 44 years by a woman who spent her final weeks planning for my survival, and now by a woman who found me through the same act of kindness that saved a starving stray dog on the side of a Tennessee highway. Biscuit still sleeps between us most nights, older and grayer with every passing season, moving a little slower up the porch steps each year, but no less devoted to circling between the two of us at bedtime, as though standing guard over something he alone understood the value of, long before we did. Some mornings I lie awake early, listening to his slow, contented breathing and Diane's steady breath beside me, and I think about the particular strangeness of grief, how it takes you apart completely, and then, if you let it and if you're patient with it, sometimes hands you back something entirely unexpected in return. If you've ever lost someone and wondered whether you're allowed to build something new out of the wreckage, I want you to know what I learned on a Tennessee shelter parking lot at 71 years old. The people who loved us best don't want our hearts to close after they're gone. Sometimes they leave behind exactly the right instructions to keep them open. A promise about a dog, a kindness toward a stray, a small unexpected miracle waiting in a shelter parking lot for two grieving strangers to find each other. I have come to believe that Eleanor knew this all along, that she understood grief far better than I ever gave her credit for, and that somewhere she is entirely unsurprised by how all of this turned out. Love doesn't end when someone dies. Sometimes it just finds a new, unexpected way to keep taking care of you. 4 legs and a wagging tail at a time, waiting patiently in a shelter cage for exactly the right person to walk down the row and stop.